Happy Wisdom Wednesday, everyone, and this week's books of the week all tie together a very important lesson. Now, when it comes to marketing, there's so many different aspects to it. When it comes to strategy, go-to-market strategy, tactics, sales, so many different things. But if you look at all the books that I've reviewed, there's one specific theme, no matter what decade the book was written in or by whom, that all of them seem to touch upon. Now, let me get you a few of those books just to sort of prove this point. And of course, I do recommend all these books for any marketer out there. So let's use a little bit of internet magic. That was pretty impressive. I don't think I've ever used internet magic for that many books. So last week I did Play Bigger, where they talked about specifically category design. I also have reviewed the 22 Immutable Laws of Marketing. This is a Bible for any marketer. You should have this. It should be attached to your hip, and it's not that very big. You should memorize these laws. Of course, Al Ries and his daughter Lori also came up with the Immutable Laws of Branding, another fantastic book, especially if you're setting up a new brand. Crossing the Chasm, another classic Silicon Valley book that talks about the technology adoption curve and what it takes to get into the mainstream market. And of course, the sequel to that book is Bruce Cleveland's Traversing the Traction Gap, where Bruce, a venture capitalist, talked about the area where all startups seem to fail when it comes to getting traction and getting that funding. So what do all of these books have in common? All of them touch upon this one key area: creating a category. Now, what do I mean by category? Let me ask you a question. Who was the third streaming video company? You remember who the third was? What about the fifth social media platform? We don't know. We only know who was first and who was the best. So when I say streaming videos, you think of Netflix. When I say social media, many of you may think of different things, but the one that people often think about is Facebook. When I say electric cars, Tesla was not the first electric car company, but they have now owned that category. You see, when it comes to customers and consumers, our brains are all the same, right? Our brain finds very easy ways to categorize things. And because of that, it's super important to own a category. So as a startup, when you start with a product, the dumbest thing and worst thing you can do is try and go into an existing category, not being the first and trying to become the best in that. Rather, what you need to do is narrow down and focus the category to something more specific. So Facebook, many of you may not know this, but Facebook wasn't exactly a social media company for everybody. They first started with college students, right? Tesla wasn't the first electric car company for everybody. They started out with very high-end electric cars, and then they started to own more and more of the market down to the affordable one. The key here is starting with a category. If you can't be first in a category, go start a new one yourself and focus the old category down. So for example, when I was at Mazor Robotics, we weren't the first robotic company in the world, right? Not the first robotic surgical company, but we focused down and talked about robotic spine surgery. Right? And lo and behold, 6-7 years later, there's about 5, 6, 7 other robotic spine surgery companies, but only one had the largest acquisition and exit, which was Mazor, and one is seen as the pioneer and the top brand in the category. Now, for a startup, when you launch into anything, I can tell you this, there are many startups that have failed because of loss of focus or lack of focus, but I don't know very many startups who failed because they had too much focus. So in starting off, it's super important to get focused. And we can recall from Crossing the Chasm, the first thing that Geoffrey Moore talks about is finding that beachhead, that niche. So you might be having, let's say, a $10 billion market, but there's a subset of that market that you should really focus on and just absolutely own outright, 90, 100% of it. And then you can start expanding adjacently. When you start focusing and contracting your brand, right, it allows the consumer to put that somewhere else in their mind. More importantly, if you focus it in a way where you create a new category, this new category goes into a new place in the customer's mind and your brand gets associated with that. And as other brands start to come in there, your brand will start to grow in more and more space. Because if, for example, the electric car brand, right, which wasn't very big many years ago, it starts growing. So now everybody has an electric car, right? But guess what? Tesla's brand gets stronger by the day because as more people come into this new category, they were not necessarily the first, but they made sure that they became the best in one specific area. Again, electric cars for luxury, and then they started expanding the brand to start owning more and more of that electric car category. So how do you do this as a startup? Well, you have to do two things at once. Number one, you have to launch your brand, obviously. But number two, and this may not be so obvious, you have to promote that category itself, right? One thing that I can point to is from my past is at a Potrero Medical, right? Our CEO, Joe Urban, and I one day sat down at the very beginning when I got hired, and I said, Joe, what category does Potrero fit in? What do we want to own? Because at the time, we didn't want to be qualified as a simple Foley catheter company, right? We were so much more than that. And his thing was, we want to be predictive health. Predictive health has existed for I think since 2005, but nobody promoted that category. Nobody attached their brand to it. And so as we started building the company and going to market with the product, we made sure to also co-promote this category of predictive health. And of course, if you fast forward a few years later and go Google it, and you'll see this, you'll see that the Pentagon invested in a program called Predictive Health. You'll see predictive health all over the place. It's not because we invented it, right? Of course, I'm sure there were other predictive health companies that were there first, but we were the first ones to promote the category and associate our brand with it. So because of that, if you do this the right way, the person you're trying to sell to will take that category and associate your brand as the new and more importantly, the leader. And again, going back to Geoffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm, when you start going through the early market and the pioneers of your technology adoption curve, to technically get to the early majority, which is this big hump, this is where you cross the chasm and your market share starts to go up. That segment of the audience or that segment of the market wants a de facto standard. They want a full solution. They want to go with the market leader because that's just how they are, right? So that's the lesson of the week. Definitely check out those books. I highly recommend them. And as always, happy Wisdom Wednesday. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you next week. Bye for now.